newspapermen meet such interesting people. They know the lowdown, now it can be told. I'll tell you quite reliably off the record about some charming people I have known. For I meet politicians and grafters by the score, killers plain and fancy, it's really quite a bore. Oh, newspapermen meet such interesting people. They wallow in corruption, crime and gore. Ting-a-ling-a-ling, city desk, pull the press, extra, extra, read all about it, it's a mess, meets the test. Oh, newspapermen meet such interesting people. It's wonderful to represent the press.
And the media project is underway for another week. Welcome. My name's Ira Fusfeld. I'm the retired publisher of the Daily Freeman of Kingston, New York. Sitting in this week for Rex Smith, who gets more time off than ever. I don't quite understand that, but we'll give him that.
You give him that. I'm not giving him that.
Well, that's Alan Chartock, the CEO of Northeast Public Radio, Professor Emeritus at the State University of New York, publisher of the Legislative Gazette, and former publisher of the Fire Island Times?
Sun,
okay.
Many, many years ago.
Yes. Rosemary Armao is here.
When I was 23. I got married to a widow who was pretty as can be. This widow had a grown-up daughter with her hair so red my father fell in love with her, and soon this pair was wed. This made my dad my son-in-law. It changed my married life. My daughter was my mother because she was my father's wife. To complicate the matter, even though it brought me joy, I soon became the father of a bouncing baby boy.
If I asked you what you had for breakfast this morning, you wouldn't be able to remember that. How do you remember that? Well, this is already off the rails.
I only know limericks that my father taught me that I can't repeat.
Rosemary Armao is here. She's an investigative journalist and a professor at RPI. And Barbara Lombardo is with us, former editor of the Saratogian and the Troy Record, and she is a professor at the University of Albany. And despite what you may have heard already, we're going to try to analyze, assess, and argue about the media issues of the week. And let's start with this one. You know, we've talked a lot on this program over the years about problems that are endemic to journalism that theoretically journalists can fix, whether it's bias or just plain inaccuracy, but the kinds of things that hurt the trust in media and have made media at risk for even surviving. Well, here's one that I don't know that we're going to agree media can do anything about, and that is the number of lawsuits that are described by the Columbia Journalism Review as crippling and frivolous that are being assessed against media organizations. And the acronym is SLAPS, Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation. And the CJR says that they have become the leading threat to journalists and press freedom worldwide, and have stifled critical reporting on organized crime and political corruption. What can we do about it? Do we just let them, no pun intended, slap us down?
It is a growing problem, but it has been a problem for a while. John Oliver famously fought against a slap suit several years ago when he reported, and I know it's a comedy show, but he does great investigative reporting, actually, and he reported on a coal baron who was making, billions while his workers were in terribly unsafe conditions, and the guy came after him with a ridiculous lawsuit, and he publicized it, he made fun of it, and he won the suit. So that's one thing you can do, is you have to not back down. Hard to do, though, when these suits require the expenditure of huge amounts of money to fight them in court. Even though you're going to win, they eventually do get thrown out.
Sure, but you still have to come up with thousands of dollars to hire your own lawyer.
Exactly. So the things that can be done are you publicize every one, you call them out for what they are, and you lobby like hell to get the laws changed, which have happened. Several states have changed laws, and internationally, it's harder to bring these kinds of suits in, say, England than it was a few years ago. So we're not completely helpless.
Well, and yet we have a Supreme Court which is, to put it mildly, reactionary. And it's not going to be a terribly favorable place.
They won't do anything to help the press, but slap suits don't apply only to the media. They're being used now. They're actually used mostly against activists who are trying to fight evil corporations. Environmentalists, exactly. So this is a case that if it did go to the Supreme Court, we might get a ruling that would be favorable. They're just completely unfair.
But as you point out, it's expensive even if you're in the right to defend yourself.
Correct.
Barbara, I'm sure you remember our time working for the same company, and it was not easy to go into a budget meeting and say, well, it cost us thousands of dollars in deductible, even though you're insured against libel. The big boys who spend the money don't want to spend it on that.
Right, and I remember having even a reporter who was sued for something that they wrote, and it was an egregious error in the paper, but it was unintentional, and we corrected it as best that we could, and the lawsuit was eventually dismissed. But the amount of money that we spent on that was basically a reporter's annual salary.
Yeah, I seem to remember at my place we had a $50,000 deductible. Now, we never lost a libel suit. I believe we settled a real small one once for $5,000 just to make it go away. But how many of those $50,000 deductibles are you willing to spend before the newspaper ownership says, don't do that kind of story anymore?
Yeah, you can't fight slap lawsuits by fighting the lawsuit itself because you'll just run out of money. It's reporting like the article that we're all looking at as we talk about this. By Joel Simon. He used to be at the Committee to Protect Journalists. It has to be united, coordinated effort by journalists to bring to light what's happening. It's an attempt to shut down critical voices, and that's what it has to be portrayed as. There's nothing fair about these lawsuits.
Yeah, and it's critical.
Have you ever been sued?
Yes.
What did it feel like? Did you feel like you were vulnerable or that you were being...
Yeah, you don't want to go to court ever. You don't want to be the focus of a story. You want to write about a story, not about yourself covering the story. But it also was quite a kick because they said something that was completely and easily refuted. And so,
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Rosemary. And the other thing to keep telling the public is that it isn't, as you mentioned, that it isn't just against journalists. Also, Ira, that these are suits that can be against environmentalists or anybody else who is
anybody who
telling
takes
the
a
truth.
stand against a big, rich organization that can fight the truth about it. I find a lawsuit, though, a little easier to take than what we're seeing in Las Vegas right now, where an official didn't like a. Right. You're going to bring that up. Didn't like an article, so he killed the reporter. You can't really fix that.
Say again how that works.
This is a suspect. This is as of this morning, as we record this. A suspect has been arrested in the fatal stabbing of Las Vegas Review-Journal investigative reporter Jeff German. The police declined to give further information as we speak, but this announcement of the arrest came after the newspaper and other news outlets reported that the home of Clark County Public Administrator Robert Tellis, who had been the subject of recent stories by German, was searched by authorities. So we don't know, again, as we sit here, whether it in fact was this Tellis who was arrested, but all signs point to that. And this is unusual. On the one hand, very rarely do you have reporters targeted. On the other hand, it's a dangerous profession. There have been 293 journalists are in jail around the world, and dozens more have been killed in this past year.
It's only rare in the United States that journalists are rarely targeted, and that is because elsewhere in the world it's really easy to target them, and you're likely not to be pursued, much less arrested, and definitely not convicted in a court. In Russia, for example, journalists are routinely beaten up or shot to death. Anna Politkovskaya several years ago was shot coming out of the elevator of her house, point blank in the face. It was on Vladimir Putin's birthday, but I'm sure that was just a coincidence.
What was the most famous case? I believe the most famous in the recent decades, Don Bowles.
Don Bowles was that was the start of investigative reporters came about that. He was in Arizona, and he had been a reporter covering mafia and organized crime. And he went to meet a supposed source who had set up a meeting in broad daylight downtown in a public place, and nobody was there. When he got into his car, it blew up, and he died 11 days later, suffering horribly. And what happened then was extraordinary. 46 journalists from around the country went out to Arizona and took all his notes and finished his reporting. And that was the start of this coordinated attempt by journalists to respond to threats and intimidation and worse of reporters.
So what's behind all of this? The fact of the matter is that all of us sitting in this room know how passionate anybody who gets their name in the paper, right or wrong, can be, and what their reaction can be. They get very angry. They can blow up. Their relatives get angry. So how do you avoid that?
Well, I dare say each of the four of us at one time or another received what would be construed to be a particularly threatening letter or phone call.
You bet.
So the answer to your question is it all depends on what you got inside you. Because most of us are going to just try to plunge forward and seek police protection if necessary. Fortunately, it never came to that with me. I don't know about you guys. But
I worked for a long time, in Eastern Europe for an organization covering organized crime. So we got more than our share of threats and actual actual attacks. And our view was that, yes, there is a risk. So you don't act blithely against it. You could be fired in this organization if you did not report to your boss any kind of threat or a phone call or anything, no matter. You couldn't be macho at all, even though these reporters really were. They did put their lives on the line, but you had to report it. And then you took steps, like you would shake up your routine, never walk the same way home every day. You would go with another person. You would set up appointments with people who are kind of shady in public places. There's a whole series of things that you can do to reduce the danger. And our policy was, as soon as you got information verified, you published it, because that's what they're trying to do when they threaten or kill you, is to stop the information. So you get it out just as soon as you can.
Have you ever been threatened, Barbara?
Yes, I have, and so have at least one person who was on my staff at a time, and we both had to have police intervene. Mm-hmm. And for her, the police went to this person, and actually we had to go to court for them, and those people were ordered not to come to the Saratogian. And one person who had since moved out of state, who had threatened me in city court, if he came into town, they could arrest him. Wow. And so, yeah, it was scary, and you kept doing your job, but you tried to make sure you were going out when it was light out, or if it was dark, park your car where you could get to it quickly and easily.
And lock it.
And lock your car. And in the newsroom, there was absolutely no security.
Well, I was just going to say, most places, I've not surveyed everyone in the country, broadcast and print, but certainly in my place, it was pretty much wide open. When we opened for business at 8 o'clock in the morning so people could walk in and buy their classified ads or whatever, all you had to do was open the door and
I miss those days, too. And people could just come in off the street. But I remember one place I worked in, there was a threat, and so my colleagues hung a sign over the desk that said, "She's the one that wrote it," with an arrow pointing down. And of course, it's funny. It was funny then. It is not funny now, and those days are long gone.
It is not funny. And, I give a nod to the people at the Annapolis newsroom back in 2018. And that was a sister Gannett paper for a long time, where the Capital Gazette, where somebody came in and shot up and killed staff members. And I think there probably was a spurt of attempts to lock up newsrooms after that, perhaps. But it's impossible to keep that safe.
Yeah, man. And Rosemary points out the fact that the building and the newsroom in particular were wide open was good for you as a reporter and an editor, because people could walk in and provide information to you, or just sit around and talk.
They felt part of the
and vice versa.
Lack of engagement and trust. We didn't have it so much back then.
Right.
Well, you're a very tough person, Rosemary. If you saw somebody coming at you after you wrote something, do you have any sense of what you might do?
I'd like to think that I'd be really brave and yell something snarky at him, but I probably would freeze and be unable to move. I mean, you can talk big, but
knowing you, I suspect
I go down fighting.
Yeah, well,
Thank
not
you.
Go down, but you would. You would hold your own.
Mostly the people who do threats against reporters, if they give you a threat, it's because they want you to back off. If they can really do something about you, they don't threaten you. They just freaking do it. That's what we found. We did a story about food safety in Bosnia, and we wrote stories about the freshness of food at various outlets, including ice cream places. And we had a real lab test, and then we ran a list of the places that weren't up to par. There was like bacteria and stuff. And an ice cream owner told my reporter, an ice cream store owner. I mean, he made ice cream cones. That was his job. And he goes, "I know where you work. I know where your editor is. I know the door she comes out, and I have a brick." So I went out a different door for a while. But it's just kind of silly stuff.
We had an older man who used to come to my market, Ulster County, in the city of Kingston every year during the summer. And he wore a big red multicolored caftan. And he would protest around town. He'd have signs, etc. And there was something in the newspaper he didn't like. He walked into the building one day and just planted himself in front of my desk. I was still in sports then. We don't know whether he was dangerous or not, but I'll make a very long story short by saying we finally called the cops. That literally, as they dragged him out of the building, you could see his skid marks on the rug. Now flash forward. The Berlin Wall is coming down, and I'm watching, and I'm looking closely, and there he is on the top of the Berlin Wall, and the last time we saw him, he had fallen over to the eastern side, so we don't know whatever happened to that guy, but we almost felt a sense of pride that he was our local protester. Of course,
that war story wins.
And of course, the final piece to the puzzle about concerns is now with the proliferation of guns. Again, in the old days, people might come in and yell and scream and they get dragged out. Now we all hide under our desks. So.
And of course, there's always the question of what a newsroom owes its employees in terms of their safety. Do you spend millions of dollars, what could be millions of dollars, reinforcing all the glass?
We're talking about news organizations.
Yeah.
They're selling their old buildings. They're getting rid of reporters. They're hiring freelancers who go into dangerous situations, especially overseas assignment, with no protection whatsoever.
Yeah.
So it's taking advantage of journalists' sense of courage and responsibility to want to cover these stories. In the same way they took advantage of your work ethic. If you were on a big story, you didn't go home when your 40 hours in a week were done. You worked on and on. You didn't get paid for it, and they knew that. So, yeah, news companies have never been great about protecting or helping
But to
its
the
staff.
point, and Alan raised it, is that there is a certain obligation on the part of ownership, whether it's radio, TV, or newspapers, to protect their employees and themselves. So you're suggesting it's very expensive, and I don't have any doubt that it is. But what would happen if, God forbid, somebody was killed in the building that was not well protected, and the lawsuits would
And as the
arise.
CEO of the organization that I had, I can tell you that that question does float around my mind from time to time.
We saw it with COVID, too, protecting employees against and from COVID while also requiring them to report. That was difficult, and another kind of danger.
Yeah, and there are certainly reporters who, in their blood, are willing to run into the face of danger to provide the truth and to go after stories, whether it's in another country or in our country, and take those chances. Thank goodness for them.
Right.
This is the Media Project. Ira Fusfeld, Alan Chartock, Barbara Lombardo, and Rosemary Armao here with you. Well, last week, Judy Patrick made mention of the fact that it wouldn't be a media project if we didn't talk about Fox News, and I suspect that we'll get there. But speaking of getting there, we've also been talking a bit about CNN and what's going on there and the purported move from what they would say is the center, what others think is the left, but in any case, moving closer to the right. I want to talk about that, but first, just as an indication of what's going on, the new CEO there by the name of Chris Licht, who's well known in TV and broadcast circles, announced this week the hiring of 2 people to his staff. One was Dr. Tara Natula, who is going to be the medical correspondent and apparently used to be at CBS. And the other, interesting to me anyway, is John Miller, who was going to be the chief law enforcement and intelligence analyst. I don't know if you guys know Miller and know his work, but he's been around forever. He started at local television in New York. He was the guy who you'd have readers and listeners who sit at home listening to the police scanner, hear something went down, and he would immediately run out and be on the crime scene. So he became affiliated with the cops, almost a second cop. He became very well known as the person who covered John Gotti the most. Later, he actually had an interview before 9/11 with bin Laden, and then spent most of the last couple of decades in the New York and Los Angeles police departments as a spokesman and as a counterterrorism expert. So he's been hired by CNN, and on the face of it, based on that resume I just suggested, he could be a good hire, not left, not right, but a good hire. And then reports came out that when he was working for the NYPD, he testified falsely, and he knew it was false, that the NYPD was surveying and targeting Muslims and Muslim mosques, and he denied that the NYPD was doing that. It's well documented since that it has. Does that put this hiring, based on what little information I just gave you, does that mean CNN should say, sorry, we made a mistake, no John Miller for us?
Well, of course, they should. Whether they will or not, doubtful.
Well, those 2 hires come in the wake of Brian Stelter being let go, the media expert, Jeffrey Toobin being let go, the legal analyst, and John Harwood, the most recent, a political correspondent who's worked for a couple of networks, also let go.
Well, what did Toobin do that was so bad?
Well, Toobin, I don't know whether he was let go for this because he would have been let go a long time ago, but you know the answer to this question and you want me to explain it?
Yes.
He masturbated in the middle of a Zoom meeting with colleagues.
Right. And so
it was very foolish.
He was suspended. And
Why did he do that?
Exhibitionist, lazy, didn't think, anybody could see what he was doing. It was just dumb.
And we know he did it. In other words,
there's no question he did it.
Speaking of lawsuits, we're not going to get sued for saying he did it when he didn't do it.
No, just trying to find the right way to say it on the air.
Yeah.
Outright.
So anyway, all of this is going on at CNN, and as we described a couple of weeks ago, CNN is now owned by a conglomerate of Time Warner and the Discovery Channel, and the man who leads that organization, his name is John Malone, who is a avowed, I don't know if he's a member of the Federalist Society, but he leans right politically. Although he denies it, it's thought that he was the one who got Stelter fired because they believe Stelter was too critical of his media as well as other media on the right.
I think it's a troubling trend that we're seeing at CNN and elsewhere. Politico just got taken over by a guy who loves Trump, too.
And so what's the trend? The trend is
that the media is becoming more and more right-leaning. And under the guise of, no, we're just trying to balance things. You don't see Fox News hiring liberals to try to become more balanced. What
well,
you
they
see
do,
is
but they don't hire real liberals.
Yeah, they hire voice pieces, Juan Williams. But what's happening here is troubling. He is hiring people who have, as you noted, some real qualifications. So you can't, on the face of it, say, oh, my God, this is a tragedy and an outrage. But the trend is bad. I'm looking at Acosta. If Jim Acosta gets fired, then we're going to know for sure.
But the trend that you're describing at CNN, they will say they want to be more down the middle.
Right.
The evidence so far is they're trying to compete against Fox, and the further evidence, statistics are showing that CNN's ratings have gone down since all of this has begun.
Yeah, would that work?
Would it work? Fox is a juggernaut.
Yeah, no, I get it.
And not only that, people who do not like CNN, it's going to take an awful lot of convincing to make them think that they will like CNN.
I agree.
Under new guys.
I think CNN was a more straight news organization before the Trump administration. And I don't want to say that he started it, but he called CNN, as well as the whole media, the enemy of the people. He targeted CNN, and I don't blame them for punching back over those years.
Well,
and it used to be MSNBC if you wanted to have the left, and Fox if you wanted to hear the right, and CNN if you wanted to hear more objectively down the middle. So if they're able to go that route, I think it's good to have a news organization that can provide that. Maybe NPR already provides that in the news. I'm skeptical about what's really going to happen here.
Let's presume, for the sake of argument, that CNN wanted to become, just as you describe it, the middle of the roader, the place that you go for accurate news. In this world of partisan politics and silos, would that even work?
No.
And who's going to listen? It's not a good business
People
decision.
want to watch MSNBC if they believe what they're saying, and Fox or the other right-wing channels if they want to hear that information. And that actually is what got CNN in trouble at the beginning. When they were more in the middle, they were losing people, which is why they started to become a more opinionated channel than they had been.
Some of the things that the new owners have done, I applaud. Getting rid of the breaking news on every little piece of information they put out. Getting rid of those horrible panels where everybody is completely divided and they just yell at each other and nothing is resolved. If they get rid of people like Brian Seltzer, who I have a big respect for, but also get rid of the Corin Lewandowskis and the Kayleigh McEnany's that they hired ridiculously. Please hire journalists, not partisans, if you want to be a real journalism outlet. That would be great if they went back to reporting news that has two sides or more sides and you present all of it. That would be great. But so far, all we're seeing is that they're getting rid of people who are willing to take on Trump in his own terms.
Right, and that's
dangerous.
Stelter is one of those
Exactly.
people.
And who's left? You've got Fox News with Howie Kurtz, who oddly enough started reliable sources on CNN, but he's gone to the dark side. And, as other print commentators on the media have said, you hear us quoting Brian Seltzer, not so much Howie Kurtz, and there's a reason for that.
And I don't know if I mentioned this off air or on air, but we were talking about Howie Kurtz. He was a very well-respected media reporter for the Washington Post.
Yep.
Went to CNN and brought his expertise and his neutrality there, and then left and went to Fox, and all of a sudden I find myself saying, whatever happened to Howie Kurtz? Because this is not the same guy.
Exactly.
You mentioned Politico. The new owner of Politico at one time invited executives to pray for Donald Trump to be elected, and now he's in charge of running a fairly influential, at least in the Beltway organization.
Yeah, that scares me because Politico has had a well-earned reputation for being a hard-hitting, objective, tackling issues, and this scares me.
Rightly so. That should be grounds for not having the job he has.
The other part of our discussion that always interests me is whether or not people or organizations can lobby the press. In other words, can people who have a bone to pick change the way the press reports things just by continually suggesting that they are anything but honest?
Sure. If you go through I'll use the word channels, and it sounds too formal, but relative to what we were talking about before, if the door of the newspaper or the radio station is open for visitors and the visitors come in or they call and make an appointment and they state their case, it's not difficult to presume that you could be convinced that, well, gee, we haven't really done it the right way. I'll use a personal example that's a little bit different. We at the Daily Freeman wanted to start a Spanish language newspaper because we saw the growth of the Spanish community in Ulster County, and we thought this would be a way to attract a whole new audience. In the lead up to it, we invited key people in the Hispanic community, to inform them, but also to ask their opinion about what people who speak Spanish would want to read and hear. And in many cases, it was different from what we had set out to do. But if you listen to the public, you're not kowtowing, you're being smart.
Well, I think the voting machine companies are showing how you get the attention of media. You have to have money, and you have to have a threat, and you have to say, show us the proof. You say we're corrupt and
well, you also have
dishonest.
to have a good case. I mean, they
have a kind of extremely great case.
Which brings us to the one Fox reference, or the one specific to Fox. This was reported by NPR's David Folkenflik. Fox was urged by a producer at Fox to not let Jeanine Pirro back on the air.
That's a good one.
He said she is pulling conspiracy theories from dark corners of the web to justify then-President Trump's lies that the election had been stolen from him. This is an email that people at Fox saw. Fox is not commenting, but she wouldn't be alone if we said somebody who was going way over the bounds of journalism to favor President Trump at Fox.
It's really interesting. Trump pardoned her ex-husband on his last days in office. I mean, there's a real personal connection. She has gone to the White House. She is personal friends with him and is spouting these things. I think that the discovery of that email must have brought tears of joy to the faces of Dominion and Smartmatic.
Although she's more visible than she used to be because she's now a regular on that 5 o'clock show.
Right.
I don't remember what it's called.
Right, she was rewarded.
She was rewarded.
Back.
Yeah, she's
Well, let's remember that 40% of the American people are with her and them, the right-wing Trumpers. That's a lot of people.
My fingers are crossed that when the lawsuits are done, that there's actually some penalties that are going to hurt.
Really? Well,
I know, I'm so
You're
naive
so
and hopeful.
naive. Oh, my
yeah,
God.
I think
We
so.
don't hurt companies in this country. I mean, look at
I mean-
Juul. They were marketing directly to teens about vaping products, and they didn't admit it. They didn't admit anything, but they signed a settlement, and they're going to pay 1/4 of 1 year's income. Please.
Well, we're just about out of time. Thank you for joining us. I'm Ira Fusfeld with Alan Chartock, Rosemary Armao, Barbara Lombardo, our producer David Gastina. Join us again next week for The Media Project.
Prostitution, I don't know. Ting-a-ling-a-ling, circulation, ting-a-ling-a-ling, advertising, get those readers, get that payoff. What a headache, what a mess. Oh, publishers are such interesting people. Let's give 3 cheers for freedom of the press.